Okay. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank the organizers, Professor Martinelli and Dr. Cerchione for this kind invitation. I'm really honored. And Professor Falini. The title of my talk is The Role of Minimal Residual Disease in Acute Myeloid Leukemia, or better, Measurable Residual Disease. I will discuss it from a clinical point of view. So I start with the statement that the quality of treatment response is likely the best predictor of outcome for any given patient. This is because at diagnosis we are able to detect several cytogenetic or molecular abnormalities that we are using to define different risk categories. We are able to perform a proper assessment of the patient characteristics, so defining whether they can receive an intensive treatment or not. But there are many variables that we don't know, such as the drug-host interaction and also the role played by the tumor microenvironment, just presented by Dr. Cerchione. Once treated intensively, the vast majority of our patients get into remission, approximately 80% of them, at least for low-risk or intermediate leukemia. But the real problem is that a high proportion of them subsequently relapse, around 30-40% for low-risk leukemias, 50-60% for intermediate leukemia, 80% for high-risk leukemia, meaning that defining the complete remission with the standard criteria is not good enough. And this is not surprising if we consider that around 10 to 10 leukemic cells left over. So we need a more sensitive platform as compared to light microscopy to assess the residual disease, and these platforms are now available. They are the multiparametric flow cytometry, the molecular biology, currently the RTQ-PCR. Even though there is nothing minimal about it, as we can see, this is why the definition minimal changed into measurable residual disease. First of all, we must keep in mind that European Leukemia Net recommendations have introduced the monitoring of MRD as a prognostic factor, and most importantly, have introduced a new response category that is complete remission without minimal residual disease. So it is time to introduce in our daily clinical practice the monitoring of MRD. Here are depicted three hypothetical, simplistic, probably models of leukemogenesis. In the first, at the top, a class 1 mutation that induces proliferation combines with a class 2 mutation that impair differentiation. As a final result, we may have a leukemia with a higher number of leukemic cells endowed with stem cell properties, in other words, leukemic stem cells. In the second model, the class 2 mutation precedes the class 1 mutation. As a result, we may have a leukemia with a lower number of leukemic stem cells. In the third model, both mutations occur late. This is very important because MRD is a disease mainly composed of leukemic stem cells by definition. So the first model may be representative of a high-risk leukemia, the second of a low-risk leukemia, the third, for example, of acute promyelocytic leukemia, and the intermediate risk leukemia group probably lies in the middle. So what about low-risk leukemias? We have the lucky combination of a chemosensitive disease, according to the model just presented, with the probably most sensitive tool in our hands, that is RTQ-PCR. And this German group, with regard to NPM1 mutated acute myeloid leukemia, convincingly demonstrated that MRD positivity is associated with a higher risk of relapse, but in this case, relapses may occur late, even more than 1 year from remission. And by doing multivariate analysis, they demonstrated that other risk factors lost their significance. Instead of bone marrow, the UK group tested peripheral blood, and with the same results. But the good news comes from the French group, which demonstrated that MRD-positive patients, I'm talking about NPM1 mutated acute myeloid leukemia, MRD positive may benefit from an allogeneic stem cell transplant that seems to abolish the negative value of the MRD. And this led to this treatment strategy proposal by Professor Fallini and Professor Martelli. What about core binding factor? They behave the same. The MRD is the higher prognostic factor for relapse. And again, for this data come from Seattle, MRD positive patients may benefit from an allogeneic stem cell transplant. So we may conclude that MRD detected by RTQ-PCR represents a very good predictor of relapse and is associated to remission lasting even longer than 6 months. That transplant can significantly reduce the MRD-associated relapse risk, that MRD is the most significant independent risk factor for relapse. So moving toward intermediate or high-risk leukemias, they must be evaluated by flow cytometry that has a broader applicability, probably a less sensitivity, is subject to operator bias. So several prospective clinical trials of ONSAC and CRI again clearly demonstrated that MRD positivity is associated with a higher risk of relapse, but in this case, relapses occur early, within the 6 months. This is the study from the Anderson Cancer Center, and again, MRD positive is associated with a higher risk of relapse, and relapses occur early. It is very impressive how much these two curves diverge. But the bad news in this case, differently from what we have seen for low-risk leukemia, come from Seattle. They observed that MRD positive patients assessed by flow seems not to benefit from an allogeneic stem cell transplant. They tell us that if you have an MRD positive patient, the transplant won't work. The outcome is similar to those patients that are transplanted with active disease. And this meta-analysis seems to confirm this. So the question is this really true? Or is this really true for all risk groups? Our colleagues from Rome first retrospectively evaluated around 150 patients from 4 different RTC-GMMA-ML protocol trials. MRD negativity, this was the sensitivity threshold, and the sensitivity threshold matter. This is a good sensitivity threshold. The time point was post-consolidation. What they observed is that intermediate karyotype leukemia, if MRD positive at the end of consolidation, become a high-risk leukemia. If MRD negative, become a low-risk leukemia, and that a good karyotype leukemia, if MRD positive, become a high-risk leukemia. And these evidences may influence our treatment decision as to whether to allocate a patient to transplant or not. And these evidences also prompted these authors to check this hypothesis in a prospective trial, the GMMA-ML 13 chain trial that has very recently been published, led by Professor Venditti. You can see the risk categories. And what they demonstrated is that MRD positive patient, intermediate risk patient, MRD positive by flow cytometry may benefit from an allogeneic stem cell transplant, similar to what we have observed for low-risk leukemia. And they concluded that pre-transplant MRD positivity should not contraindicate delivery of an allogeneic stem cell transplant. So I may conclude that MRD detected by flow is associated with early relapse, that transplant cannot significantly reduce the MRD-associated relapse risk, even though provides better outcome than chemotherapy alone. So we must do a transplant. And most importantly, that intermediate risk ML patients may benefit from a risk-adapted MRD-driven therapy, allogeneic stem cell transplantation for MRD-positive patients. Last 2 minutes, challenges and opportunity. Minimal residual disease is really still a work in progress because All these issues, interlaboratory standardization, choice of methodology for the future digital PCR, NGS, best time for MRD evaluation, best source, peripheral blood, or bone marrow are all open questions that need to be addressed by future prospective clinical trial. Another great challenge, to my opinion, a very interesting challenge, is to identify not just the residual cells, but specifically those cells that are really responsible for disease recurrence, the leukemic stem cells, that we must keep in mind they make change during the disease course under a Darwinian selection. They can be selected by a changing microenvironment. They may be selected by a changing therapy, so it's hard to follow them, but it's very important to try to do it. Opportunities. MRD gives us the opportunity for an early detect of an impending relapse post-transplant. If you have a patient that become MRD positive post-transplant and was MRD negative pre-transplant, something you have to do because a train is coming, so you can reduce the immunosuppressive therapy, you can use DLI, you can use hypomethylating agent, as done by the Relasa study. We can use new target drug. We don't know what to do, but is another issue that needs to be addressed by future clinical studies. And my last slide, the new drugs. We are living an exciting era where new drugs are already available, and where several other drugs will be coming soon. So how they interact with MRD, how they interact with transplant that remain the most potent, the powerful weapon against the leukemia. So with regard to available drug, Gentusumab ozogamicin has been demonstrated for low risk or intermediate risk leukemia to reduce the residual disease after treatment. So it will probably reduce the number of patients that need a transplant. Midostaurin or CPX 351 for high-risk leukemia. You have to transplant these leukemias, but it seems that these drugs make the transplant work better, probably reducing the residual disease before the transplant and allowing the graft versus leukemia effect to work better. Censoring the patient at the time of transplant, the disease-free cures diverge more. So I think that we are very close to incorporate minimal residual disease into our daily clinical practice for a MRD-driven therapy. And I think also that we are moving toward a therapy directed against MRD prior to allogeneic stem cell transplant. My final conclusions are that MRD assessment is changing the concept of disease remission, that MRD should be included in every ML clinical trial, and we need a prospective clinical trial, that we are close to a MRD-driven therapy, and in the next future, we will probably move toward MRD-directed therapy to make the transplant work better. Of course, safety need to be considered. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Gottardi. We have time for 1-2 questions. I have one question. Which is the time schedule that you would advise for NPM1 mutation following complete remission?
Following complete remission, I think that the right time is to perform the MRD evaluation every 2-3 weeks for the next 2 years. Yes. Okay. So 4 times a year for 2 years. Okay. Following the suggestion from the European Leukemia Net group.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Yeah.
Do you think that cell-free DNA will be a good source for MRD evaluation?
Field 3?
Cell-free DNA. the circulating
We don't know.
extracellular
It's
DNA? Are there
a
data?
real challenge, yes. Probably it will be, yes. You may have the advantage to detect a specific lesion of the clone of our leukemic stem cells. And the second advantage is to test it on peripheral blood that is more reliable because you have you reduce the risk for a dilution of the samples. So,
Okay.
but I really don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We move on. And the last speaker is Professor Petrini, that will talk about assessment of MRD versus that of somatic mutation for predicting the outcome of AML. Mario.
Thank you, Brunangelo. To thank you, I'll be very fast, because almost what we need to know about minimal residual disease has been already shown. But, no? Okay. Some concern about the study of minimal residual disease is what we have to study. What is indeed minimal residual disease? And I have some trouble with this. Okay. I might shorten my talk. I will focus on molecular minimal residual disease. There are several techniques available now. The more common is still the real-time PCR, but we are engaged in evaluating digital PCR and next-generation sequencing. However, the difference in the methodology will reflect on the relevance of results. European Leukemic Network states that to study minimal residual disease, we have to study these genes, whereas they state that there is not prognostic significance in evaluating previous MK-founder clones, neither the evaluation of minimal residual disease will be useful evaluating the genes mutated in germline. Moreover, WT1 expression should be not used because the low sensitivity of this method and the most common genes mutated, FLT3, NRAS, ADH1 and 2, and so on, should not be evaluated at single markers. So we don't know really if minimal residual disease has to be restricted to the 4 currently used and validated molecular markers. Here we present our experience in 2 studies. The first one to assess minimal residual disease in 56 patients. The second to look at additive mutation in 98 patients. And we try to integrate all these results to show our point of view. We evaluated the molecular disease by assembling an homemade PCR test, and we evaluated all these genes to assess their role in the possible minimal residual disease and their prognostic role. 2/3 of patients are mutated. So the mutation we did found with that study is quite frequent. For many genes is online with the literature. We did find a very high expression of WT1. At the diagnosis, several mutations are frequently present in the same patient, as expected from the lecture of Brunangelo this morning. We find a relevant impact in prognosis, this is progression-free survival, when divide our patients in patients with more than 3 or less than 3 mutations. This results impact both on progression-free survival and in overall survival. 90% of cases with additional mutation achieved complete remission compared to 43 patients without any additional mutation. So the role of the mutation in genes not included in the evaluation of minimal residual disease according to a European network might be relevant. Moreover, the additional mutation shortened the overall survival in 20% of cases. In a larger number of patients, and this is the table showing the characteristic of patients, we still evaluated the role of additive mutation. At the baseline, 98 cases were tested for NPM1 FLT3 mutations. 59, that means 60% of patients resulted mutated for 106 mutations detected. 31 patients were FLT3 mutated, 38 patients were NPM1 mutated. 11 subjects were NPM negative, FLT3 negative, but presented additional mutation. 61% of our patients showed at least one additional mutation. 84% showed an high expression of WT1. A WT1 expression did not correlate with clinical parameters. 78% of NPM1 mutated patients obtained complete remission as expected compared to 42% of wild-type NPM1. The presence of FLT3 not significantly correlated with complete remission. What is relevant, as stated this morning, is the mutated wild-type allele ratio and the burden of the mutation in this gene. After induction, 39% of NPM1 mutated become negative. In the positive patients, appear relevant to evaluate the burden, the mutational burden. And we put a threshold on the reduction of 1 log. 60% of FLT3 mutated cases become negative. What we noted, as reported in literature, that some patients have a different behavior between FLT3 and NPM1. We don't know if this depends on the different sensitivity of the method or reflects a different behavior in the cell clones. The entity of clearance of NPM1 larger than 1 log conditioned 1 year overall survival. So the Eiger reduction was found in patients with 1 year 100% survival, whereas when the reduction is less than 1 log, only 44 patients were still live after 1 year. Persistence of LT3 per se is not correlated with the prognosis, rather the quantitativity of FLT3 is related with the prognosis. Concerning VT1 that should be not studied according to European Leukemia Network, the high expression of WT1 impact on the prognosis of the patients in a relevant way. You see patients with high expression compared to low expression patients. Thus, the additional mutation behind those selected by European Leukemia Network are relevant. MDR is predictive. Combination of this, the evaluation of this gene might be relevant. Finally, IDH2 gene mutation might be really interesting, and we are now evaluating those mutations by droplet PCR. I want to show just one case. This patient was positive at the beginning. He stayed positive after the first line of therapy, the second line of therapy. After the third line of therapy, the patient was in complete remission and molecularly negative, but EDH2 was still present. After bone marrow transplantation, the patient was 100% donor, WT1 negative or very low expressed, and negative for IDH2. But shortly, at the first control, some IDH appeared again, whereas the patient was still full donor, and quickly the patient relapsed. So maybe now we should use inhibitors, specific inhibitors of IDH2 in this kind of patients in maintenance. In conclusion, NPM1 is the most predictive gene. The slope of decrease in our hands is relevant as prognostic evaluation. WT1 is also a good predictor gene in our patients. The persistence of additional mutation play a negative role in our casuistics, and ADH2 could be a promising marker for minimal residual disease. Thus, I suggest that we don't have to limit our molecular evaluation, and we need more studies to modify the European Leukemia Network suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Are there any questions or comments? Yep.
Thank you, Mario, for this presentation. I've seen that you believe, apart of the European Leukemia Net recommendation in WT1, I would say that apparently, in the case that you presented, indeed, this was after stem cell transplant. Indeed, because there was a full donor chimerism and so on. So I think that probably WT1 may be not so sensitive just to detect the decrease of, but in specific cases, in particularly after allo stem cell transplant, in which the level of the normal WT1, let's say the normal level of WT1 is lower than in persons non-transplanted, I think it could be very useful. This is not really stated so far in the European Leukemia Network recommendation.
This is the point. WT1 is related, high expression of WT1 is related with a poor prognosis. Of course, the sensitivity is not so high, but at the present, I think we should integrate more parameters in order to modify the prognosis. So it is a little bit too strong to state now that only NPM1 and core binding proteins, NPML, RAF, of course, are suitable for minimal residual disease. We need to have a more larger view on this site.
Yes. Okay, if there are no other questions, no. So thank you, Mario. Thank you. And we move to the next session. Okay.
So, because of delay and transport problem, we anticipate the lecture of Dr. Aferlach. Please. Dove? Thorsten, where is he? Ah, so. So you can take your plane in time.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Sorry for bringing all this program now into a different order. Thank you very much for having me here in this conference. We heard a lot now about genes, we heard a lot about prognosis, and I will have the title that I should tell you a little bit about NGS and AML and MDS, and I would like to focus more on the technical point of view and what is possible right now and what will be possible in the next future. And because we know that all these leukemia diagnostics that we have to deliver aims for many different things. We would like to make the diagnosis, the classification according to the WHO. We would like to know about prognosis, risk stratification. We would even like to stratify therapy, give some predictive information, and for MRD, as we heard in the last talks. Now, if we just focus on this book, and this is what we have to adhere to, and we look into the field of AML, these are all the markers that we have to address just for the classification according to WHO. And if we then add information on prognosis, these are the markers. And the question is, how could we get to this? So we can do chromosome banding analysis, we can do FISH, we can do PCR, but maybe we should do more, or maybe we should do more in one technique. And this is what I think will be the future, if not the reality already right now. Because you know, the landscape of AML is much more complicated than just these genes from the WHO, and we saw these papers, some talks before already as well. And although it seems to be very easy to diagnose MDS based on WHO, because if you look on the molecular part, you only need SF3B1 to do this correctly. If you then read the chapter in the WHO book, there are some more genes relevant already, and that also changes not only today but also tomorrow, because there are a lot of new targets coming. And if we look into the landscape of MDS, then we are already sure that this is much more complicated as we thought 10 years ago MDS will be on the molecular level. Now with respect to NGS, NGS has a different machines in the market, they have different options, they have different possibilities to sequence in once. And what you can see here already is that the gigabases you can sequence from one to the other machine is quite different, from 0.065 to up to 3,000 gigabases in one run. And there's one company that has a lot of machines in the market and covers 95% of the worldwide market by next generation sequencing, and this is this company here. And as you can see here, they have several machines, and what they also, and what is very important for our routine, but also for our research progress, is that we can use several flow cells. And if you just look over here and see what the maximum output of a machine is, it differs from 1.2 gigabytes to 3,000. What also is of interest is the runtime is always around or less than 2 days. And if we, and I will address this in the last 3 slides, look into the field of exome sequencing, genome sequencing, and transcriptome sequencing, you can see if you use instruments of NGS that are available in the market, you can sequence up to 250 exomes per run in one run. And this is quite scalable, and that is quite of interest because we will realize that there is more and more need to investigate this at diagnosis, and the question is, how could we do this, and is this feasible? What we already also know is that there are a lot of guidelines already published how to not only run NGS sequencing, but also how to interpret the data, what to do with the data. And to tell you right now already, there's a bottleneck in interpretation and not a bottleneck with respect to techniques of next generation sequencing in the field. However, if you just focused on the machines and the option that can be now delivered to the patients in routine and can be accredited, we achieve a very high sensitivity, specificity. All these NGS runs are scalable and flexible, and we achieve a very high reproducibility by doing this. Now, coming to the field of AML and MDS, these are panels that are commercially available, and all these panels cover more or less the same genes that are of importance for myeloid neoplasms. And if you look right here, there are the companies and here are the panels. And you can see here, there's based on DNA, there are already some assays available that combine DNA and RNA information. And depending on what your interest is, and if you want to apply this for a routine, you can use such panels and the different machines. However, many people of us use homebrew panels because they are interested in these genes, but more not in genes. And we are also using these panels not only for routine, but also for research. And if you have a basic research interest in some genes, you would implement them in the panel already. There are also those genes from germline AML that we heard in the last talk included in our panel. And what you can see right here is that we, in our routine setting, accredited setting, use 72 genes. And in addition, we add to all these vials for each patient a so-called human ID. It's a human identifier with 23 loci of SNPs and polymorphisms, and it has a specific pattern, like chimerism, to pick up this specific patient. The incidence of seeing one patient at the same time is 1 to 80,000, so you can, every time when the patients come back to your lab, pipette this human ID into the vial. You can be sure that this is the same patient for pre-analytic reasons. There's one exception when the patient has been transplanted allogenic. Now, when we start now to data interpretation, I told you before that this is a problem still. We have these raw reads from the machines, and we go for mapping against the human genome, the alignment, and then we do the variant calling. And here we have several different algorithms to do this. And there is still a lot of change in the market, how we will do this today and in the future. Further, we then finally have to go for variant interpretation using some other databases. And we have an already in-house so-called ML predictor that was already using artificial intelligence. And with this, we completely implement all our data interpretation of the last 14 years into the next interpretation of the next patient. So if you come up with a mutation like that after sequencing of, let's say, 19 hours, within a second we get all this information from all the databases that are online available and our complete information over the last more than 10 years, what we decided for this mutation and in which disease we found this one, and then it helps for the next interpretation of the next reporting. If you set this up in a routine setting, this all can be done within 2 days. That means the turnaround time is 2 days minimum in our hands. It will change in the next years when the sequencing time of the sequencing machine will go down, because I told you before it's below 2 days, it's around 1 to 2 days. It will go down to some hours in the next years, so that can be at least done in 2 days from now. But if you then got everything already, then you have to write a report, and the report has to be understood by doctors and patients, and that's really another problem, because if you just talk to a molecular biologist, it made me quite difficult to understand the report if you're a doctor and you have never seen what a mutation is, because when I studied there was no mutation in the world. So we have to put all this into the report for quality control reasons and for accreditation, the sequence regions, the coverage and the dropouts classification. Is this really a mutation? Does it mean it's somatic, it's damaging, or it's a germline, or it's a variant of unknown significance? Then you have to tell about the variant allele frequency, the diagnostic significance, the prognostic significance, and if this is a marker that can be used for MRD. Now we learned, and we also saw this before, that there are some genes like NPM1 that could be very nicely used for MRD, and there are others that are still highly found to be mutated, although those patients are in complete remission. And these genes are not very feasible for any kind of MRD using NGS, and especially because NGS, in the way we use it right now, achieves a sensitivity of around 1 to 3%, and this is not MRD ever. So we have to think about increasing the coverage, what would be very expensive, or you're looking for other methods like digital PCR or quantitative PCR as we use right now, but finding the mutation that has been found at diagnosis by NGS and then go forward with other techniques for MRD. NGS so far is not the method of choice. What I would suggest, as the techniques may be better in the next future, it may be different. Now finally, what I would like to tell you a little bit looking into the future, because I think what I told you right now is the reality right now and should be used in routine. And the question is, how could we move forward? Will be whole genome sequencing or whole exome sequencing, including RNA-seq, be a method for the future of diagnostics, or only in clinical trial, or never ever? So will we only study some genes, or some genes included in a panel, or for better reasons, just look from the early beginning into the genome? The question is, could we do this? The answer is yes. How quick could we do this? The answer is very quick. Not quick enough for an AML, I admit this, but if you start for genome sequencing right now and use machines I showed you before, with library preparation, sequencing, data processing, the turnaround time is below 1 week. This is accredited, and this can be done. So the sensitivity we reach is a coverage of more than 100. This is not what we normally achieve when we do panel sequencing with a median sensitivity of 1,800, but anyhow, 100 is a good sensitivity to see all these mutations that we normally pick up in the range of 1 to 5%. Now what we did, and this is just research right now, this is not routine, we did more than 4,000 cases whole genome sequencing with the different diseases you see right here. The median coverage is 106. We did for all these cases also transcriptome sequencing. And this means we have now information for more than 700 AML and more than 700 MDS. And now we can really look into what's ongoing, not only in some genes and some chromosomes, but we can completely see the complete DNA and RNA information using NGS techniques. So what I think, and this is one of my last ideas, if we go for precision medicine, we will, in the near future, let's say in the next 5 to 10 years, not go for some panels by NGS, but go for exomes or genomes even, including transcriptomes, and then define the respective mutational profile to get to the best targets for treatment and for MRD markers as well. Because we have to admit that if we are sitting next to the patient, there's much more than just one gene. There is the laboratory, there's the pathology, there are all these information I showed you before, and there are a lot of other markers that we are already taking into account, and this finally leads to the idea of precision medicine driven by data and by NGS. Now, in conclusion, NGS and AML and MDS so far in routine can support and already supports the diagnosis, the classification, and gives us ideas about prognostication. Panel testing today is the state of the art. There are commercial assays available. Data analysis and reporting is still challenging, and there are some tools coming up in the next years. And targeted treatment will focus today on DNA and RNA findings, and in the next future, and this is research only right now, but will be routine in some years, I think exome sequencing at least and RNA-seq will be in the field of the definition by NGS of AML and NMDS in the clinical routine. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Please.
And do you think that NGS will replace conventional karyotyping, also picking up translocations?
Yes, we
Yes.
do this. We
Okay.
do this. We see this. My wife, she's a cytogeneticist running this project, and she will be out of work in the next some years because there will be no chromosome bending analysis in our laboratory.
Okay, thank you.
Giovanni prima e poi Domenico.
Thanks to coming from Germany. It's a great honor to get here the faculty of the Anderson Cancer Center, probably the faculty that are moving quickly all the new ideas in clinical practice. And it's a great honor for us to get you, that you are moving immediately on the diagnostics at the higher level in the world. I know, so I'm totally grateful for your presence here, presenting this, which is, as I mentioned 2 months ago, when I was in your buildings. I asked what's the future, and you mentioned that is the future, with a 45-second response of the entire genome, interpretation of the entire genome. 45 seconds is nothing. Of course, there is a lot to work to do, but if the future is to get interpretation, interrogation of a DNA in 45 seconds means that we will be able to provide to our medical doctor an answer and a possible therapeutic suggestion. The problem is some years ago, the medical doctor were unable to ask because they don't get a response in a quick time. Now, in Germany, they are more lucky than us, getting a response in a very short time, but the interpretation of the data will be very difficult because there is not too much culture. So how did you suggest therapeutic approaches, or you stay just in the back, giving the information, the deleterious of the deletion you have found out, or you believe that your role will be in the future also suggesting therapy?
No, well, you cannot do all this what you just addressed with only molecular biologists. You can't do it with only bioinformaticians. You can't do it only with cytogeneticists. But you can't also not do it only with hematologists. So we need all this connected, and then the final result is best given to the patient. So what we do is we see what is coming out of the machines together with our molecular biologists, but we interpret together with our hematologists, and then we transform this into the reports that a doctor can understand. But this is for sure a very difficult task.
Are you in favor of a molecular board, the
Yes.
so-called molecular board
Yes.
in the hospital that make
Absolutely.
interpretation?
Without that, it wouldn't work. Also for me, I'm old, I have to get some information from others.
Thanks.
Domenico.
What do you think about the future and developments of liquid biopsy in hematological malignancies and especially in leukemias by using tumoral DNA, exosome, and so on?
Yes, we tested this in our research part, and we so far will not include this in our routine setting. I think there is much more data already available for solid tumors, but not in hematology. There are some data for lymphomas. There is some data also for multiple myeloma. We are testing this in that field. Right now, I cannot comment on it very positively, but we still will test that. Let's ask me this question 3 years from now again. Right now, I would not suggest to implement it in any routine setting, because this is my experience.
Okay.
Are there any more? If not, thank
Thank
you
you
again.
very much. Thanks.
So we start the proper session, Biology of Acute Myeloid Leukemias. The first, Metabolism of Acute Myeloid Leukemia. Simonetti, where is she? Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for this kind invitation. Today, I will show you some new insights regarding the integration and the potential integration of genomic and metabolomic profiles in acute myeloid leukemia. As we heard by Professor Aferlach, actually the classification of AML is mainly a molecular classification that is based on the presence of recurrent leukemia-related mutations and cytogenetic alterations. This led to the definition of 13 classes, molecular classes, which help the genomic classification and also prognostication of acute myeloid leukemia. However, genomics is just one of the features of the complex leukemia phenotype, which includes also epigenetics, transcriptomics, and also metabolism. Indeed, tumor suppressor genes and oncogenes regulate their metabolic reprogramming of leukemic cells. And alterations, both from a structural and functional point of view, targeting metabolic enzymes, cooperate to this process. The most relevant example that we have in acute myeloid leukemia is represented by mutations of IDH1 and IDH2, which force the production of the oncometabolite 2-hydroxyglutarate, and that can be targeted by specific drugs. In parallel, it has been shown that the glucose metabolism is predictive for clinical outcome and chemotherapy response in acute myeloid leukemia. Regarding the metabolic features of acute myeloid leukemia cells, it has been shown that stem cells are mainly addicted to oxidative phosphorylation rather than glycolysis, and this is sustained by amino acid metabolism. In the last few years, several evidence appeared regarding the possibility of targeting metabolism in acute myeloid leukemia. Indeed, several drugs has been tested which target dehydroorotate dehydrogenase, pentose phosphate pathway, amino acid metabolism, among others. However, most of these studies were conducted in AML in general, and they didn't look at subtype-specific features and vulnerabilities. Few of them highlighted specific vulnerabilities, including the role of glutaminolysis in FLT3 mutated AML and of the creatine kinase pathway in AV1-driven AML. Altogether, these evidence suggests that the integration of the genomic and metabolic profile could help a better understanding of the leukemic phenotype, and this could drive improvement in personalized therapeutic approach. What we did was to achieve a multi-layer characterization of acute myeloid leukemia by integrating genomic and metabolic profile. To this aim, we performed whole exome sequencing of 165 AML cases, and 21 cases were characterized by targeted NGS when germline sample was not available. Among these patients, we had serum and urine samples of 119 AML cases, and we performed nuclear magnetic resonance analysis of biofluids. This was compared with data from 145 healthy controls. Of a subset of AML patients, we also had primary cells for intracellular metabolite analysis, which was conducted by mass spectrometry. This was performed on 35 cases of CD34 positive cells from AML patients and 15 CD33 positive cases for those who lacked the expression of the CD34 antigen. And these data were compared with the intracellular metabolic profile of cord blood CD34 positive cells and normal peripheral blood CD33 positive cells. Whole exome sequencing analysis showed that 17% of variants target metabolism-related genes. These include leukemia-related genes which are involved in metabolism, as IDH1 and IDH2, but also metabolic regulators and enzymes. Enzymes include both those encoded by nuclear DNA and those encoded by mitochondrial DNA, which mainly belong to the respiratory chain. 88% of patients carried at least one mutation in metabolism-related genes, and 73% of them had a mutation which was predicted to affect the protein function. About 32% of metabolism-related genes were enzymes, and so they were directly involved in the metabolic activity. When we analyzed these mutations according to superpathways classification, both in our cohorts and in the Cancer Genome Atlas, we observed that most mutations were targeting lipid metabolism, followed by cellular respiration, carbohydrate, and glucose metabolism. And the data were comparable between the two cohorts. Regarding the metabolic profiles, at intracellular level, we were able to differentiate and distinguish normal and leukemic cells, both in the CD34 and the CD33 population. And what we observed was that the main differences in the CD34 positive blasts regarded lipid and amino acid metabolism and bioenergetics. Lipid and amino acid were also among the most relevant pathway for the CD33 positive AML cells, which also included nucleotide metabolism. At biofluid level, we performed for the first time an integration of serum and urine metabolomics, which allowed an accuracy of 0.9 in the separation between normal and leukemia. And this was obtained by analyzing 7 principal components, which is a restricted number compared to the 10 and 12 components which are needed to obtain a similar separation by using serum or urine alone. We then focused on the ML population itself, and at intracellular level, we observed that unsupervised clustering of the intracellular metabolomics allowed the distinction of 3 clusters. Cluster 1 showed a general high level of metabolites, Cluster 2 a general low level of metabolites, and Cluster 3 had a mixed, was more heterogeneous. We then asked whether these clusters could belong to different genomic categories. And what we obtained is that cluster 1 is enriched for NPM1 mutated AML, cluster 2 for chromatin spliceosome mutated AML, and cluster 3, which had a higher level of heterogeneity, was enriched for TP53 aneuploid AML. We therefore sought to achieve a similar classification by using serum and urine metabolomics. And an unsupervised analysis conducted on these 3 classes allowed us to obtain a distinction also at biofluid level. Indeed, NMR data distinguished 4 clusters, and 3 of them were enriched as the previous one for NPM1 mutation, cluster 1, for chromatin spliceosome mutation, cluster 2, and for TP53 aneuploid AML, cluster 4. We then checked more in details to the metabolic features of the NPM1 and TP53 subclasses, and what we observed at serum level is that NPM1 mutated AML had a higher level of pyruvate and succinate, and they had lower levels of amino acids, including glutamine, alanine, and phenylalanine, compared to NPM1 mutated AML. This was at serum level, while at intracellular level, NPM1 mutated AML showed higher levels of nucleotide, including adenosine, guanosine, thymidine, and uridine, and reduced level of biochemicals belonging to the xanthine and inosine pathway. When we checked the metabolic features of the TP53 mutated or deleted AML, we observed that at serum level, a principal component, which is PC4, coming up in the unsupervised analysis, distinguished between the wild type and the mutated or deleted cases, with the 70% of TP53 altered AML clusterizing in one of the two subgroups. At serum level, TP53 mutated or deleted AML showed a reduced level of lactate, glucose, alanine, and threonine. In the end, our data suggests that metabolism-related genes are frequently mutated in AML. These include mutations in leukemia-related genes targeting metabolism, but also patient-specific metabolic alterations. The integration of metabolic and metabolomic profiles, so intracellular and biofluid level, can improve our understanding of the leukemic phenotype and pathogenesis. Biofluid and intracellular metabolic profiles differ according to the genomic classification in general and to specific mutation and alterations, as we observed for NPM1 mutated AML and TP53 mutated and deleted AML. The integration of these different levels may suggest novel vulnerabilities that needs further exploration, specifically in the nucleotide metabolic pathways for NPM1 and in the bioenergetic pathway for the TP53 mutated or deleted AML. I would like to thank all of the people that collaborated to this work, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you. This is open. Beppe.
Thank you very much for this nice presentation. Sometimes, however, it's difficult to establish a link between a metabolic alteration and the specific defects. So, which is that is giving us the idea or the proof that indeed this is not simply a phenotypic appearance or something secondary and not necessarily implicated in the pathogenesis of the leukemia?
So what we are doing now is try to figure out the link, the real link. So the way that we decided to go is to simulate the effect of the mutation on the intracellular metabolic profile. So for those that are enzyme, we can simulate the mutation effect and then see which are the real changes in the metabolism, and then going back to our mass spectrometry data of the intracellular metabolomics, we can try to understand, even though there is a high degree of complexity in patients, which one can be really a real effect of the mutation.
I have a quick question, very nice work. So the OXPHOS genes, you mentioned that the leukemia stem cells are driven by OXPHOS genes. Have you been able to identify a specific genotype that was associated with this OXPHOS signature? There was a recent cancer cell paper from a Montreal group, and they showed that this triple mutated DNMT3A NPM1 FLIC3 genotype was the higher sensitivity to OXPHOS inhibitor that they tested. So I wonder if your data support the same or not.
So right now, it's probably a technical limitation, but the metabolic profile doesn't allow to go into the details of the oxidative phosphorylation metabolites. So we cannot achieve this integration between the genomics and those specific metabolic level.
Congratulations, very nice work, very elegant, and also very nice presentation. I was wondering if you are somehow thinking about which comes first. I mean, do you think that the metabolic alteration may somehow influence some mutation, or the opposite? I know that it's very preliminary, and the second point is, do you think that targeting some metabolic mutation might be one of the possible opportunity for the future? Thank you.
So the second question is easier. The answer, in my opinion, is yes. That's why I was working on that. So the idea is to define whether there are subtype or personalized alterations in the metabolic pathways that can be targeted, because what we see right now in general is that metabolic inhibitors are generally effective on all AML, but that's preclinical data. It's not real life, as we know. So I think that there is a need to understand and integrate this level, and this can improve targeting. So the first question is a little bit more difficult. So in my opinion, metabolism is a highly relevant feature, because of course a cell cannot survive if you really eliminate some crucial metabolic pathways. In my opinion, mutation come first, but then when disease progresses or then is under the pressure of treatment, then metabolism can become more and more relevant.
Okay, Cristina, last question.
Last question, just a comment. Very nice paper. I would like to report a personal experience to add some more insights on this view. We recently identified what I like to call a cytogenetic epigenetic entity. And this entity corresponds to a defect on lipid metabolism. The entity is identified by what we know very well, which is the 1,7 translocations, which was considered a variant of monosomy 7. But once we analyzed this translocation in terms of exome sequencing, of SNPs, of other genomic aberrations, we didn't find any common denominator. The only common denominator was a down-regulated signature, gene expression signature, and this by RNA, defined by RNA-seq. And so we analyzed epigenetics in this blast, and we found that there was an epigenetic signature corresponding to the downregulation, which means an hypermethylation of specific sites, and the genomic sites which were specifically hypermethylated were enhancer. And we made annotation of these enhancers. They corresponded in 35% of cases to genes regulating lipid metabolism. So this is, I think, a very important way to confirm your view, which means that we even have cytogenetic, epigenetic entities.
Yeah, I agree. This is also a little bit scaring, because here we have metabolomics and genomics, but then we need the whole genome and epigenetics.
But the question is...
And that's true.
My question is, did you analyze your data on cytogenetic subgroups, considering cytogenetics of your case?
So that we did, however, so we have most of patients, these patients were collected progressively. We have a lot of patients which have normal karyotype and the most common genomic alterations, but then we have few patients belonging, for example, to the core binding factor subgroups or some other subgroups, and then it gets difficult to understand if there are metabolic differences according to these subgroups. But that's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We must go on. Ilaria, please.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I would like to thank sincerely Giovanni and Claudio and the SOHO board for this kind invitation. This morning we heard a beautiful presentation highlighting the need of finding new and better therapies for acute myeloid leukemia, especially elderly and high-risk cases. And my presentation goes in that direction as well, however, from a different starting point. We have a fundamental, but sometimes overwhelming, as we heard in the latest presentation, genomic data. So I think it's very important to understand the role that these different genetic lesions have and play in leukemogenesis and how they can be used as a targeted for better therapies. And so I will apply this approach to the study of acute erythroid leukemia and how we show how we need to really understand the role of the different alterations. Acute erythroid leukemia is a high-risk leukemia subtype characterized by predominant erythroblastic proliferation in the bone marrow. It has been diagnosed and subclassified by morphology alone using a variable criteria over time. It was firstly described and recognized as a distinct leukemic condition by an Italian hematologist, Giovanni Di Guglielmo, almost 1 century ago. However, after that, it has been always a subject of controversial classification. And in the latest WHO classification of myeloid malignancies, it disappeared, but in the classification, it was merged to a hybrid group of acute myeloid leukemia, not otherwise specified, non-erythroid subtype, or myelodysplastic syndrome, based only on morphological criteria, blood cell count, but without taking consideration the genomic features. And we know that this classification has now important therapeutic implications. By a landmark genomic study, we analyzed over 2,000 acute myeloid, erythroid, myelodysplastic, pediatric, and adult cases, and we demonstrated that acute erythroid leukemia has a distinct mutational spectrum, different from other myeloid, non-erythroid, myelodysplastic syndrome cases. It comprises 6 age-related genomic subgroups with a distinct mutational spectrum and distinct gene expression profiles. It includes cases with mutations in TP53. These have high expression of MECOM complex karyotype, and predominantly these are older patients. We only had 2 pediatric cases in this group. NPM1 adult and pediatric normal karyotype AL, MLL or KMT2A. They were mostly partial tandem duplications. We only had 2 cases with rearrangements. These are both pediatric and adult. They are characterized by high level of OX expression. Adult normal karyotype, DDX 41 cases. These have a health spot missense mutation. We only had 1 case with a frame shift germline mutation, typical of the Caucasian population. NAP98 rearranged AL. These are only pediatric cases. They can have both normal or complex karyotype, and they have a very specific and unique gene expression profile. In 38% of cases, we couldn't identify a recurrent exclusive mutations, but we found that these cases were enriched in mutations in S6L1, TAT2, and splicing genes, suggesting that this group can be more similar to myelodysplastic syndrome. Genomic and gene expression subgroups were the best predictors of outcome. We didn't find associations with outcome when we considered the classical morphological features, but clearly genomic and gene expression subgroups were able to discriminate between the different groups, with the TP53 mutated, NAP98 rearranged, having the worst prognosis, and as expected, NPM1 mutated cases having the longest survival. So genomic features are definitely necessary to proper diagnose and risk stratify these patients, and the spectrum of myeloid malignancies shouldn't be simply grouped in the same category, otherwise defined as myeloid malignancies. This was even further demonstrated when we compared the mutational spectrum of acute erythroid leukemia to that of myelodysplastic syndrome and acute myeloid leukemia. And as you can see from this graph, acute erythroid leukemia is characterized by much higher frequency of TP53 mutations, lower frequency of canonical genes mutated in ML, but higher frequency when we compare to myelodysplastic syndrome. Lower frequency of canonical genes mutated in MDS, such as splicing mutations, but higher frequency when compared to ML. So acute erythroid leukemia is kind of intermediate in terms of mutations between acute myeloid leukemia and myelodysplastic syndrome, but definitely is a distinct entity. So, in order to understand the role of the different identified genetic alterations in leukemogenesis, we previously expressed by viral transductions NAP98-KD5A in stem cells that then were used for transplant assays. And we demonstrated that this fusion, which is recurrent in the pediatric cohorts, promotes penetrant acute myeloid leukemia, whereas co-expression of NTRK TP53 co-occurring mutations promote aggressive acute erythroid leukemia, which is highly sensitive to inhibition by TRK inhibitors. However, I showed you before that the majority of mutations occur in key pathways such as cell cycle, DNA repair, DNA methylation. And so in order to model these loss of function mutations, we used genome editing to induce alterations in 10 recurrently mutated genes involving key pathway regulation of cell cycle, cohesion, DNA methylation, regulation of chromatin, and transcription. And based on the cooperation and mutual exclusivity of this mutation in patients with the AL, we generated 6 different pools of guides RNA against these genes. These pools were used to induce genome editing in Cas9 stem and progenitor cells. Transduced cells were flow sorted and were transplanted in lethally irradiated mice for assessing leukemia development. And developed tumors were then comprehensively characterized for genomics, for lineage specification in order to understand how different mutations are important to drive a specific phenotype, for differentiation, and for gene expression and epigenetic perturbations. But these models are not only important for understanding functional points, but also because they provide a powerful platform for exploring therapeutic intervention. So what we found, in contrast to the uniform representation of guides RNA in cells pre-transplant, developed tumors showed enrichment of specific guides RNA with specific tumors according to the specific mutation. Here, these pie charts show the enrichment of guides RNA in leukemic cells from mice that develop tumors. We found that concomitant editing of certain genes, such as TP53, BCOR, NFIX, DNMT3A, promote in mice the development of an aggressive acute erythroid leukemia, as demonstrated by flow cytometry and immunohistochemistry, positive for common erythroid markers such as GATA1, RNX1, GLA, and negative for common lymphoid and myeloid markers. Concomitant editing of BCOR, TET2, and TP53 promoted the development of acute lymphoblastic leukemia, positive for CD19, B220, PAX5. However, predominant loss of RB1 together with TP53 mutations resulted in a mixed erythroid lymphoid phenotype that shared from the same cells both erythroid and lymphoid markers. And finally, editing of DNMT3A and TET2 without TP53 promoted the development of T-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia. We demonstrated that these leukemic clones arising from primary tumors are serially transplantable in secondary passages with generally a shorter latency at the subsequent passage. By deep targeted sequencing, we showed that CRISPR-Cas9-induced genome editing is stable across serial transplants. However, by whole exome sequencing, we identified acquisition of somatic spontaneous mutation acquired driving clonal evolution. And TISIT map summarized the results. Each column is a different mouse, each row is a different gene. And you can see that there are additional mutations that are acquired during clonal evolution, such as Notch1 mutations in the TLL model or signaling mutations in AEL model. And this recapitulates what we found in patients with generally signaling mutations that are acquired later, compared to, for example, DNA methylation mutations that can be the founder. By single-cell analysis, we demonstrated that cells harbor more than one driver, like, for example, TP53, DNMT3A, BCOR in the same cells, and that clones that then acquire additional mutation in signaling genes, or in this case in DNA repair, then drive clonal evolution in subsequent passages. So, do these models really recapitulate acute erythroid leukemia? By unsupervised hierarchical clustering of transcriptome data from the established tumors, we identified the specific subgroups associated with leukemia lineage. And by gene set enrichment analysis, we demonstrated that the tumors that were diagnosed as acute erythroid leukemia have a signature characterized by overexpression of erythroid megakaryocytic markers, and they are enriched of genes that are normally overexpressed in acute erythroid leukemia, as we demonstrated in the human study. Mutational patterns and the gene expression profiles are associated with distinct methylational patterns, as you can see here, with the generally acute erythroid leukemia being hypomethylated and acute lymphoblastic leukemia, NAP98 myeloid leukemia being hypermethylated. We saw that mutations in DNMT3A result in hypomethylation, but when they co-occur with T2, they promote hypermethylation. A differential methylation analysis confirmed hypomethylation of CpG islands in genes that encode for transcription factors important for lymphoid differentiation, and hypomethylation of genes important for erythroid differentiation. So, how we can translate these genomic results in therapeutic choices, and can we drive therapies based on the genotype? In order to address this question, we used human cell lines and our primary mouse established tumors for sensitivity to over 200 therapeutic agents, including epigenetic regulators, protein kinases, cell cycle checkpoints, and of course, conventional chemotherapeutics. And this was done in a high throughput way using an automated system. Results are here presented as area under the dose response curve. On y-axis, there is the total drug exposure with a higher value represented higher sensitivity and lower values compounds for which cells are more resistant. And then on the x-axis, there are the different compounds. We found that drug sensitivity is associated with leukemia genotype, with T2, the DNMT3A double mutant, and TP53 wild-type tumors generally being chemosensitive to a wide variety of compounds. They include both conventional chemo or bromodomain and extra-terminal domain inhibitors. NAP98 KDM5A, which is very important for the pediatric cohort, we generally got a huge grant from NIH to study only this group of patients, were sensitive to several BET inhibitors and to TOPO2 inhibitors, but they were resistant to conventional chemotherapeutics drugs. Finally, TP53 mutated AL cells were chemoresistant to a wide variety of compounds, but they were found to be highly sensitive to different PARP inhibitors. And we analyzed more in details the mechanisms of sensitivity to PARP as a single agent, and we found that these tumors have a specific gene expression profile which is independent on the BRCA status. And so this had something more to what we know based on the therapy in solid tumors, where sensitivity to single agent is generally dependent on mutations in other DNA repair genes. Sensitivity was demonstrated in vivo when combined with decitabine. We had tumors that were not sensitive to single agents since they have different signature, but they were sensitive to a combination with decitabine, with a very reduction of the spleen size and leukemia burden. There are several ongoing trials using talazoparib, but this one is very recent. It's just opened around 2 months ago, and is testing talazoparib for cohesion-mutated AML and MDS with excess blast. There are some preliminary data that show how mutations in cohesion genes can confer sensitivity to single-agent treatment with talazoparib. And another ongoing study is the combination decitabine and talazoparib in untreated AML and or refractory resistant AML. This study started in 2016, but still there are no results available. I also want to highlight again, we know this data, but I think it's important because these tumors are very aggressive. These are acute myeloid leukemia with TP53 mutation, signaling mutation, many other cooperating aberrations. And we found that the PDX, at least in this set of preclinical trials, were very sensitive also to only decitabine. You can see here that this PDX had a survival of 60 days compared to less than 1 month of untreated mice. So in conclusion, I hope to convince you that acute erythroid leukemia is characterized by unique mutational patterns, and that classification of myeloid malignancies and myelodysplastic syndromes should be revised in order to include these genomic features. We successfully generated genetically defined models of acute erythroid leukemia, recapitulating the diverse mutational spectra identified in human AL. We demonstrated the crucial role of TP53 and BCOR mutations in driving the erythroid phenotype. And finally, all these established mouse models are now a powerful platform that I'm using for exploring different therapeutic options. And some of the examples I showed highlight the importance of further testing and understanding the mechanisms of sensitivity to talazoparib. Finally, many acknowledgements. I would like to thank Professor Hafferlack for the genomic study, Benjamin Ebert for the functional study, and all our collaborators, funds, and people that helped us for these studies. Thank you for your attention.
Please.
Here. So congratulations, this was really amazing. But let me ask one question, because our experience is that these leukemias are extremely sensitive to this DNA methyltransferase inhibitor, like the decitabine and azacitidine. Now, the responses may not last, but these are probably the most effective. Have you done the reverse experiment, where you look at your original cohort of, it was a lot of patients, and try to match that with whatever therapy these patients actually had, and see if you get a signal there that could confirm what you saw in your, I guess, post-clinical design? That was amazing.
Yeah, that's exactly what we would like to do. So we would like to do two things. Now that we have all these different mouse models, do a lot of preclinical studies in order to associate a particular signature that we see in the preclinical setting to the drug, and then come back to the patients, and also look at the patients and see the therapy that they had in order to see confirmation or finding new correlations. Yes, that's a great point.
Giovanni.
Short question for a very excellent presentation, but Ilaria, we know. Do you believe that we can translate the message that all the p53 mutated cancer and B-core mutated cancer can be very sensitive to PARP inhibitors and the cytarabine?
No, I was hoping that at the beginning when I first found sensitivity to talazoparib, but it's not like that. There are only certain tumors that are sensitive to single agent, and I think this is very important because we cannot generalize, and we really need to find the signature that predicts, like in breast cancer where they have BRCA mutations. Here we don't have BRCA status that predicts for that. But there are other signatures that are important, and so I think that we need to find the precise mechanisms.
You mentioned that the gene expression profiling that you have done in the sensitive population give you additional information. There are any markers on the surface that we can use for identify the B-core mutated and P53 mutated population with an additional marker? I see ROR alpha, I see some genes, but in a very short time I take the picture, then I go back to study, of course.
Yeah, probably I need to look at that more in details about the surface markers. They were not in the top of the mostly significantly genes, but definitely I can take a look back.
Thanks a lot.
The very last question.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm wondering how come you used the mouse model, the SJL strain? Did you use those because they are negative for hybrid resistance?
Yeah, our mouse models for the engineered systems were the PABOY, so they are kind of classical black 6, they only express CD45.1. Instead, for the human, now having current studies on human CD34 in order to have also a model more similar to the human disease, we use NSG or NSG Gem3, which are the humanized mice, and also the Mr. G. So we have different strains, and I'm trying to understand also how the different strain, that's a good point, affects the development of tumors, because now there are different humanized mice with cytokines that can drive like myeloid, but if we are interested in myelodysplastic syndrome, probably it's not the best. So yeah, I'm trying to use different strains in order to not have the variation in our study. That's a great point as well.
Okay, thank you very much. The very last, Cristina.
Two very short questions.
Very
the
short.
First one, because I don't know if Ilaria is leaving afterwards.
No.
The first one is NAP98 is very, very interesting in erythroleukemia. And I can tell you when we identified the translocations in different phenotype, the morphology was typical for the erythroid series. So it's really very interesting. The question is, have you ever seen mutation, not rearrangement in terms of translocations, but mutations of NAP98, especially in normal karyotype?
No, not in our cohort. No mutations, but...
we didn't find any.
No mutations, but it's also particularly striking the fact that in the erythroid, the most recurrent fusion is NAP98 KDM5A, whereas NSD1 can be found in other leukemia subtypes. Acute erythroid leukemia is very enriched with this fusion that generally in mouse model do not require additional alteration promote leukemogenesis. Instead, NAP98 NSD1 requires, for example, FLT3, ITD. So that's important. We also had some preliminary data from single cells on T fusion, and it's nice to see the association of particular subtypes that have high expression, as you mentioned, of the fusion. So
we have to go on.
And the second, very short, ERCLL6 gene, a DNA excision repair, which has been published as especially clustering in erythroleukemia as germline lesion. Do you have any somatic mutation?
So some of these cases, they did not have germline, but they have the 525 hotspot mutation that has been described to be
somatic. Instead, one case had a Framshift mutation. That's the one very recurrent in the Caucasian population. So even if we don't have the paired remission samples, I think we can speculate that is the germline mutation. So yeah, that's very interesting because compared to other germline mutations that are recurrent in the pediatric setting, in adult, we see that mutation that is not so strong, so does not promote leukemogenesis soon, but requires additional others. Thank you.
Okay.
Good, we move now to the next presentation. It's my pleasure to call Professor Lemoli for a speech on novel strategies of adaptive immunotherapy in elderly patients with AML. Thank you, Roberto.
Okay, thanks Alberto for the introduction. Thanks to the organizer for the kind invitation. We switched for a while to adaptive immunotherapy from chemotherapy, although I should stress that immunotherapy is the first example of target therapy by targeting specific antigens or specific pathways. Oh dear. Okay. Several strategies have been developed over the years to harness the immune system to treat cancer by stimulating effector cells or by counteracting inhibitory pathways. We and others have demonstrated that leukemic stem cells as well as the leukemic compartment affects deeply the activity of effector cytotoxic T cells, CD8 or CD4, by inducing Treg cells, by immunomodulatory molecules such as IDO, cytokines IL-10, TGF-beta, or inducing tolerogenic DC. NK cells are cells of the innate immunity, and the allorecognition is mediated by several mechanisms, killer immunoglobulin-like receptors, NKG2D, NKG2A, 2B4. More specifically, the recognition or the lack of recognition of inhibitory killer immunoglobulin-like receptors by specific HLA class 1 molecules activate the cytotoxic machinery, leading to target cell death. Target cell death mediated by that receptor pathways, ligand, for instance, trail-like receptor, and perforin and granzymes molecule. The clinical use of all-reactive NK cells has been first proposed by Andrea Velarde and his group in Perugia in the transplant setting, the haploidentical transplant setting, where they demonstrated that the KIR-ligand mismatch in the graft-versus-host disease direction between the donor-recipient pair was correlated with a low relapse rate in AML patients. And the results have been further confirmed in the ALL setting by Dr. Pende and colleagues. However, the clinical use of alloreactive NK cells has been proposed outside the transplant setting as a means of consolidation therapy for AML patients by using KIR-ligand mismatch haploidentical cells, highly purified or expanded ex vivo from the cord blood or the peripheral blood, as an example of non-engrafting cells capable to eradicate disease. This clinical application was first tested by Dr. Miller at the University of Minnesota quite a number of years ago, where it demonstrated that partially purified haploidentical NK cells can induce short-term complete remission in a number of AML patients with a relapse-resistant disease. This, in its experience, was further extended in the pediatric setting by the St. Jude group for AML patients by using highly purified haploidentical natural killer cells. About the same time, we decided to approach a much more difficult patient population, that is elderly patient with AML whose long-term prognosis is extremely poor, with a little improvement over the years. The results of a phase 1 trial were published a number of years ago. We treated a resistant relapse AML patient not eligible for stem cell transplantation by using KIR-ligand mismatch haploidentical NK cells. In that paper, we demonstrated the successful transfer of NK cell alloreactivity. NK cells were found in the peripheral blood up to 1 month after infusion. They were found both in the peripheral blood and the bone marrow. Molecular analysis demonstrated that NK cells were of donor origin. And perhaps most important piece of evidence was that they were functionally active in lysing target leukemic cells in the peripheral blood, again up to 1 month. Subsequently, a phase 2 trial was performed where we enrolled a patient in complete remission with sort of consolidation therapy, morphological or better complete remission. 48% of patients had a suitable KIR-ligand mismatch donor. 52% of the patient with no donor represented in retrospective a control patient population. The immunosuppressive regimen was the same used in the phase 1 trial, fludarabine and cyclophosphamide, and the infusion of highly purified NK cells based on the expression of CD56 and the lack of expression of CD3 was followed by IL-2 for 2 weeks to expand in vivo NK cells. In that paper, we demonstrated that the higher is the number of NK cell clone reinfused in the patient, the better was disease-free survival. We established a threshold for NK cell clones, which is 8%, with a patient receiving less than 8% clone behaving as bad as the control population. It's not just the percentage, but also the overall number of NK cell clone correlated with clinical response, with the threshold set at 200,000 NK cell clone reinfused per kilogram. The clinical results of this comparison were recently updated and confirm the outcome curves of the original paper, reinforcing the concept that patient receiving more than 200,000 NK cell clone per kilogram did much better in terms of disease-free survival, overall survival, than patient receiving less than 200,000 NK cell clone per kilogram. It's not just a matter of numbers, but also within this platform, reinfused NK cells are able to shape the immunological response by immunoediting, being able to eliminate high-risk clone. Based on these results, we propose a flow chart for selection of donors and cell processing by introducing the novel concept of functional cell dose. that is the collection and the infusion of at least 200,000 NK cell clone per kilogram, being the optimal cell dose to achieve long-term disease-free survival. Two trials are ongoing right now. One is a rolling patient, one is still under approval. This is a multi-center national trial with the same platform used for the phase 2 trial. So patients in complete remission as a consolidation strategy are infused with the highly purified NK, haploidentical, key-ligand mismatch NK cells with the target cell dose of 200,000 NK cell clone per kilogram. The second trial, which is under approval, is directed to AML patients eligible for allogeneic stem cell transplantation, trying to eliminate minimal residual disease prior allogeneic stem transplantation. So in conclusion, the results of this early study have clearly demonstrated the efficacy of NK cell-based platform for AML patients, and this platform may represent the tool for expanding the field with innovative NK cell-based approach. For instance, the use of CAR NK cells directed against leukemia antigen. Before closing, I would like to thank all the people involved in these studies, in particular my former collaborators at the University of Bologna and my long-term friends and colleagues at the University of Perugia, led by Andrea Velardi, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Roberto. The paper is now open for discussion or comments from the audience. After the infusion, the NK cells remain in the host, or
1 month.
1 month. And the relapse incidence after infusion is different according to the number of cells infused.
Yes, it definitely is different. Is different, and of course, these data are preliminary on. Based on the phase 2 trial, the primary endpoint of the so-called randomized study we are recruiting patients now is to demonstrate the efficacy of this strategy. I say so-called randomization because there is not really randomization. It's based on donor versus no donor allocation.
Other questions? If not, thanks, Roberto. Now I call the next speaker, Professor Venditti, that presents the current trials of treatment in Italy for AML. Thank you.
So, good afternoon to everybody. Just let me thank our host for this kind invitation. You see that based on the very ambitious title that I was assigned, I should speak on the behalf of the entire Italian community of hematologists. But let's say in a very humble approach, I thought I would tell you something about the GMAM activities. And in particular, I would like to focus on these 4 clinical trials, present/past, actually. They were closed, and AML 1301 and GMAM AML 1310. And I would like also to tell you something about the future, GMAM AML 1819 and 1718. AML 1301. This represented a joint effort putting together the RTC and GMEMA. And it was a phase 3 study comparing a conventional chemotherapeutic approach versus the cytarabine. let's say, an unconventional schedule of decitabine. You know that decitabine is approved with the dose of 20 milligrams per square meter for 5 days. That is the approved schedule. In this trial, decitabine was delivered at the schedule of 20 milligrams, but for 10 days. Were recruited patients aged more than 60 years were recruited to the protocol. Of course, they had to be eligible for intensive chemotherapy, and they also had to receive a diagnosis of de novo or secondary untreated acute myeloid leukemia. The primary endpoint was overall survival. The sample size was 600 patients, and actually this size was reached by the end of June, more or less, and by the end of June, the study was closed. We had a number of secondary endpoints, efficacy endpoints. Just let me mention also that this trial was a trial of transplant feasibility, and I'll give you some details in a minute. The clinical part of the protocol was also flanked by ancillary activities, not less important. Actually, we had 3 translational programs, and the first of them was the prognostic value of MRD assessment. And I mean, this was a quite interesting activity, especially for those patients who received decitabine. We have become familiar with MRD assessment for those treated intensively, but of course we have to learn about those treated with different approaches, such as those delivering hypomethylating agents. This is the outline of the protocol. Besides comparing a conventional chemotherapeutic approach versus decitabine, this protocol wanted also to explore the role of maintenance for those who were recruited to the decitabine arm. And once again, it was a protocol also of transplant feasibility. You see that at any time point of the therapeutic course, and whatever the stage of disease, with the exception of progression, the patients could be submitted to an allogenic stem cell transplant. Of course, I don't have results, and I think that the final analysis will be finalized by 2021, and of course, we are eager to look at the final analysis, to look at the final results of this large protocol. Well, the other protocol that I would like to mention is the AML 1310. Actually, Michele Gottardi has already alluded to this protocol in the morning session. This was a GMEMA protocol of risk-adapted MRD-directed therapy for patients aged 60 years. This is the outline of the protocol. Let me mention that at the time when the protocol was designed and when the regulatory pathway was concluded, the only prognostic classification that we had available was the NCCN 209, and that is the way the patients were classified, according to the NCCN 209. So based on these classifications, the patients were categorized at diagnosis as favorable, as intermediate, or high risk. There was, of course, an accurate evaluation at diagnosis of the presence of leukemia-associated immunophenotypes. After receiving induction and consolidation therapy, the therapeutic pathway differed according to the risk which the patients belonged to. So patients within the favorable category were to receive an autologous stem cell transplantation. Those belonging to the high-risk category were to receive an allogenic stem cell transplant. Those within the intermediate category were to receive an auto or an allo according to the level of minimal residual disease as determined after consolidation therapy using flow cytometry. Important to mention that once a given patient was recognized as having an high-risk AML because of the baseline characteristics or because the MRD persistence, the allogenic stem cell transplant should have been delivered whatever the source of stem cell, so all the sources available. Well, the main objectives was to assess the feasibility of a phase 3 trial of intensive chemotherapy followed by autologous or allo based on the genetics of AML and MRD level after consolidation therapy. You see that 56 GMEMA teams were involved in this huge effort. Some clinical characteristics of the patients. Actually, 515 patients were registered to the trial. 500 are those evaluable. And among these characteristics, I would like to point out the risk category. We had 28% within the favorable, and they were to receive an auto. 35 within the intermediate, and they had to receive auto or allo according to the MRD level. And then we have the adverse category, and they were to receive an allo. Just also, let me mention this category. We also observed 47 patients who lacked an leukemic-associated immunophenotype. So by chance, they all belong to the intermediate category. On an arbitrary basis, we made the decision to allocate these patients to the autologous stem cell transplant. This is the overall survival curve, and this is a free survival curve of the overall population. So at 24 months, 56% overall survival, median overall survival. At 24 months, 54% disease-free survival. These are the overall survival and disease-free survival curves plotted according to the risk category. And well, I would like to point out on one side the outcome of those with LAIP not detected. I remind you that these patients were allocated to the autologous stem cell transplant. And you can see that they had the worst prognosis in terms of overall survival. Their curve superimposed the one of the adverse category. And in terms of disease-free survival, they had the shortest duration of disease-free survival. Let me also mention how, by applying this strategy, the disease-free survival of favorable and intermediate patients were superimposable. Well, Michele Gottardi already showed in the morning session this curve. These curves are the overall survival and disease-free survival plotted according to the MRD status. And just let me remind you that MRD negative patients were submitted to an autologous stem cell transplant, MRD positive to an allogenic stem cell transplant. So I think it's important to know that the duration of overall survival and DFS of MRD negative and MRD positive patients were superimposable. As conclusions, we can state that a risk-stratified approach integrating upfront genetic and post-consolidation MRD status is feasible in a multi-center cooperative setting. Autologous stem cell transplant might still have a role in the post-remission treatment of patients belonging to specific categories, such as the favorable one or the intermediate one that is MRD negative. And of course, we are very pleased that in a way the ELN 2017, the revised version of the ELN, recognized the chance that MRD can be useful to dissect this category of patients. And another important conclusion in our view is that using all the available sources of stem cell, allogeneic stem cell transplant was delivered to 78% of the candidates belonging to the high-risk category. That means adverse plus intermediate risk that were MRD positive. Of course, we believe that a prospective MRD-driven approach should also be explored for the favorable risk category. And based on this, I would like to mention the future. This is the ML 1819 protocol, GMEMA protocol. Well, the backbone is the same as in the previous one, as in the ML 1310. So patients are to receive induction, consolidation. We will have an MRD assessment after consolidation. Those MRD negative will receive an autologous. Again, those MRD positive an allogenic stem cell transplant. The important differences are that only patients belonging to the favorable or intermediate category will be recruited, with the exception of those who are FLT3 positive. And the other important news is that MRD assessment will be determined, MRD will be determined by molecular biology for favorable risk, multi-parametric flow cytometry for intermediate risk, and finally, on top of chemotherapy, we will add GO, and after the transplant, whatever the procedure, auto or allo, the patients will be randomized between observation or a maintenance with Glasdegib. And the study has two co-primary endpoints, percentage of MRD negativity after consolidation. Of course, we want to explore the role of GO in this, and the duration of disease-free survival in patients randomized to Glasdegib maintenance. And finally, my last three slides, I would like to mention the AML 1718 study. This is a GMEMA trial, a phase 2b/2a, combining chemotherapy, namely fludarabine, cytarabine, and idarubicin, plus venetoclax. Of course, the protocol relies on recruitment by cohorts. So this is the first cohort of 6 patients who will receive during cycle 1 FLA-IDA plus venetoclax with this ramp-up schedule up to 400 milligram. And in the next cohort, and this is my last slide, I mean, the outline will be the same, but the patients will receive venetoclax in a ramp-up schedule up to the total dose of 6 milligram per day. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks. Are questions, please? The first one.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I'm wondering whether you are going to consider in the autologous stem cell transplantation setting, are you going to consider the use of checkpoint inhibitors?
No. I think that the development of checkpoint inhibitors in AML is still, let's say, at an early stage. And, well, the body of experience is with the use of checkpoint inhibitors in combination with hypomethylating agents. So we are not going to explore this issue, and to be honest, I'm not aware, I'm not an expert in this field.
Other questions for Professor Benditti? If no,
Thank you.
thanks, and as we conclude the session.